I'll begin by presenting a conclusion as a preface. What you're looking at is an excerpt from an essay by Seth Siegelob, written in reply to Benjamin Buchloh following the critic's publication of his now seminal essay, Conceptual Art, 1962 to 1969, From the Aesthetic of Administration to the Critique of Institutions. In the text, Buchloh famously describes the political failures of first-generation Anglo-American and European conceptual art for its mode of mimicking as a kind of critique the procedures of bureaucratic management, global capital, which did not, as many of these artists hope, result in a real critique of the systems of power, but rather led to art's total subsumption under the logic and rubric of capitalism's management style. This really famous text remains a touchstone for good reason, for this remains the dialectical struggle at the heart of any critical strategy that involves appropriating the language of power in order to subvert it. Reproduction and subsumption is always a risk, and articulating that tension as a binary of conquest versus loss is always something we must remain aware of and wary of. But I begin with this section of text not because it presents any kind of totalized rebuttal or clear solution to Buchloh's dialectical framing. Rather, what we find here is an outline or sketch in the form of a list of how else we may think about the many variables and actors behind or contributing to the phenomena, to use Lucy Lepard's term, that was conceptual art. It is a list of what Siegelob calls some actors missing in action from Buchloh's selective historical framing. Included, we find individuals occupying all roles within the art world and from a range of international contexts, including collectors Herman Dahled and Giuseppe Panza, curators Harold Zeman and Wim Baron, overlooked women in conceptual art Christine Kozlov and Ursula Mayer, artists outside the Euro and North American circuit, including Louis Kamnitzer and the Rosario Group, art and technology collaborators Billy Kluver and Pulsa, and activist groups from the Black Panthers to the Art Workers Coalition. And finally, defining political events like May '68, the Bay of Pigs, and, lest we forget, the Vietnam War. Now, I should back up for a moment and just to say, because maybe people here aren't familiar with Seth Siegelob. Briefly, he's best known as an American curator and publisher in conceptual art, but one thing that I hope to do over the course of this talk, which is a new format for me, so I'm having a bit of fun with it, is to really think about how his actually very diverse career maybe presents us with a different kind of narrative for thinking about the so-called or political afterlife or after effects of some of conceptual art's proposals. So I begin with this list it was a recurrent trope really in all of Siegelob's work. Indeed, it is his fundamental organizing system, which he referred to as a foutoir, a dump. The list, for the preservationist or the archivist or someone buying groceries, I guess, serves the function that things will not be forgotten or lost from the record. But there's a second function of the list that operates as an as yet unordered set of connections and, most importantly, I think, collaborations perhaps, a host of possible connections, and the sharing of mutual influences. Though these project planning notes that I'll refer to, or editorial summations, appear at first as scattered, there is, in fact, a clear purpose, a method to this madness, if you will. For although names, titles, places, concepts must by necessity come in some suggestion, there is at the core a fundamental dismantling, or perhaps disregard, for the categorical divisions that bracket off certain subjects from others. Brackets which, if reinforced to their most extreme, can make it seem as though historical moments, movements, and figures somehow can be narrativized as if in a vacuum. So furthermore, this simple list premise serves as a method and really a reminder to apply to ourselves when considering what historical information to pay attention to or to bracket, and which neighboring or linked actors or sets of information to pay closer attention to, and what new connections are yet to be made if we think of all the possible networks that may unfold from what at first looks like a sea of information. So Siegelab, although he's best known, again, in conceptual art, he started out quite young with a fairly traditional gallery, actually, which he ran from 64 to 66, Seth Siegelab Contemporary Art. Each exhibition was accompanied by a brief catalog, more about documenting the show, and that would begin to take on a publicity function quite early. But I want to highlight this statement that he makes right on the cover of group show number 1, which is something that will recur in his, I think, recurrent ethic in a lot of the artists that he worked with, and what become real political interest or interest in labor throughout his career. And that's: the work of an artist exists as a real and final statement about what he feels. The gallery's commitment to what it feels about that statement should be just as strong. So from day one, I think it's interesting that we have this real, almost like mascot statement for the gallery that's saying that I am on the artist side. And so in '67, he pairs up with a businessman, a collector, a real estate investor who he'd met through working in art through his gallery, Jack Wendler. And they worked together to form Image Art Consultancy, what attempts to be essentially like a corporate art agency that would direct firms to not only invest in art, but also purchase art with the eye to it improving their public image. Now, it's actually not so unusual in some ways that this kind of attempt was happening at the time. I mean, since the late 1950s, we begin to have consultancy firms in the US advising collectors on art investment portfolios. Museums, again in the US, are courting corporate sponsors regularly by the mid-1960s. And in 1970, we can recall experiments in art and technology, who would be sponsored by Pepsi, right, and for the Osaka World's Fair. So already, I think it's interesting that not only is this this move by Siegelab has been pointed to as either utterly problematic in terms of feeding into a publicity machine, kind of working for the corporate end of the spectrum. But I think I want to foreground this as well, to think of it as, again, a collaboration, a partnership with someone who was a collector from him, and someone who, quite simply, Siegelab recognized as possessed really a totally different knowledge set that might direct other ways of thinking about how art could circulate or, again, be produced or be funded. Here, in 1972, when Siegelab had essentially stepped out of the art world by then, in an interview with Willoughby Sharp, Wiener was asked how to make sense of Seth's role in art. And I like that he says, whenever Seth organized an exhibition, it was obviously with the consent of the participating artists, and very clearly stated in the presentation that it had been organized by Seth. And he's careful to note that part of Seth's contribution in all of this was he listened to artists. He was one of the few people who never said, do such and such. He always said, what would you like to do? That was a brilliant move. And I want to open this up here, too, to note that if we're thinking about this idea of introducing simply possibilities and experimenting with different frameworks and pulling in techniques from other fields, I think a lot of this becomes about just what is possible when we say to the people that we're working with, well, what ideas do you have? And that kind of being a real fuel behind a lot of this work. In '69, Siegelab was already thinking about not just collaborating across fields, but also about leaving the art world. This is from a notebook of his where he's planning a communications network where people in different fields, architecture, mathematics, astronomy, chemistry, music, visual art, law, will work together on ideas and communication networks, and who knows where it was going to go. But it's this collection of really fields that are completely all over the place, and yet fundamentally have something to offer each other, maybe. And what affirms the contracts existence with a work of art is this technology of the notice, and I'm calling it a technology mostly because it's the site where the artist's signature would appear. It's the tool, the moment where the contract is fixed to the work of art, but also what affirms that the contract and all the terms in it are constantly tethered to the work as the work travels through collectors' hands, through exhibitions, through future sales, all of it. And in that, it is really what affirms not only the contract's presence, but also is what serves to really communicate to collectors that they are effectively on notice of the terms, again, by way of the signature. But I want to just point this set of questions again that he opens up with: how is art history made? And this is just a screenshot from the Egress Foundation's site. But I think it's important to note that there's a map of kind of tensions existing across his career, right? This idea of controlling copyright with the Xerox book, or taking lessons from business, from the business of publishing, which actually manifested rather badly for the artists involved, you know. Or Image Inc., right? A lesson from corporate art funding models that didn't quite go anywhere. Are any of these adoptions, you know, liberatory, or are they restrictive? The January show, Gregory Batcock calls it a revolution. Alex Albero calls it a showroom. But all of these things really are, in fact, both. And I would say that Siegelab's conceptual art publications remain most fruitful for the structural potentials they represent and what becomes possible, for better or worse, honestly, once we reimagine the structural models we are familiar with and the disciplinary techniques and collaborations available to us. And the contract especially is the product of this cross-influence and discourse between not only artists and lawyers or business people, professionals in the fields that we think are maybe outside of us, but who we do interact with. It's also the product of cross-influence and discourse between international contexts. A lot of the concepts in it are borrowed from international law, and again, between these different specialties. I could keep talking about the contract, but I want to leave, I'll read the crowd maybe, I don't know. But I'll start off, perhaps, on that by pulling this quote from Hans Hacke in that project, The Context of Art, the Art of Context, where he's asked, you know, what has been the fate of conceptual art and its political proposals. And he replies that while the ideological positions staked out by the works, in retrospect, lose the abrasiveness they might have had initially, and while they perhaps thereby become co-opted and absorbed, they may potentially still today alter not only our views on art and culture, but affect also the general ideological fabric of society. Like all products of the consciousness industry, the work may leave a trace. It is never clearly discernible, but the difficulty of recognizing it does not make it less real, or for that matter, negligible. Contract's requirement to affix it to the work of art is the device, is the thing that subsumes it under, you know, this kind of management positivist, you know, rubric. But even in Albero's and in Siegelab's introduction, he notes that it's the legal part of the work. He brackets off what the contract does, what it is, from the total work itself. And in a way, these parentheses serve to maintain a barrier between what constitutes not just the legal aspects of the work, recognizing that they might be conceptually separable from the work of itself, but also acknowledging that they can, too, remain parts of the same whole. So that the agreement acts as a kind of container for maybe the preservation of meaning or of context, if an artist wants that, a safeguard for controlling some degree of intent or economic and material use as desired by the artist. But it also becomes a vehicle for asserting the protection of those values as an ideal industry standard practice. And it's that exactly that I think gives the contract this really, I think, very special and other status in thinking through not just the history of conceptual art and the kind of collaborations that come through it or are made possible with it, but as an artifact of document-based practices, of practices where context and context specificity really come to the fore, and where all of this is underpinned by an activist interest. We have now this document that takes on a life that merges both fields of art and of law, and actually is maybe capable of asking for a rearrangement of some of the kind of serious underpinning social contracts of art.